When it comes to painting minis, there is a plethora of different ways to approach various color schemes, whether it be differentiating every single piece of leather on your miniature or something more basic like figuring out the best way to paint red armor. Personally, I'm a Chaos Space Marine collector, and I feel as though over a decade that I've been painting, I am ever so slightly qualified to talk about this process of painting red armor. If there's a way of painting it, I've most likely tried it over the years. Most people are familiar with the classic Games Workshop method of applying base coat, shading it, and then layering up to your final color, with, of course, 2 thin coats. The next method which tends to scare everyone is that of the oil wash. This technique is often viewed as an advanced process, but it's far from that. As you can see from the first 2 examples, they offer a different visual style. There are plenty of ways to go about this process, but for today, I'm going to be showing you how to achieve a quick, gritty red armor using a zenithal prime, oil wash, and some pretty easy layering techniques. First things first, we'll start by giving this little lad a cheeky prime. I'm using black for the base since it's much easier to clean up later and allows me to hide all my mistakes. And before you run away, I will be doing most of these steps utilizing an airbrush. However, you can easily achieve the same effect using spray cans, dry brushing, and your paint brushes. But I'm a bit lazy and want to get this done, so I'm going to work smarter, not harder. Next up, we'll make sure that he shines by spraying white ink from above. For this, I've chosen to use Liquitex Titanium White through my airbrush. Again, you can use a white spray can from above and slowly build up the opacity, or using a white paint, dry brush over the top of the miniature and achieve a similar effect. Since I'm using an airbrush, this will allow me a lot more control than with my spray can. I start by giving a gentle coat from the top and slowly build up the opacity as it gets closer to the head. I'm looking to make his face the focal point, so making this the brightest point on the miniature will help draw your focus in. Next up, I'm going to be whipping out my super fancy red ink, specifically Naphthol Crimson from Liquitex. This is actually a really good opportunity for you to choose what kind of red you want to use. Personally, I love the opacity of these inks, and they allow me to use my zenithal prime and get some cheaty shadows. It's pretty much a quick and easy way of just instantly painting a miniature. If you'd like to do this with a brush, I'd recommend grabbing some Blood Angels Red contrast paint and using contrast medium to gently apply it over the miniature and make sure that you get a nice even coat. Since that paint can be very opaque, I'm just going to slowly build up the opacity and until it's up to a point where I'm happy. As you can see, we get to keep most of our zenithal info. The only major downside to using this method over the entire surfaces is that now our shadows are a little bit too bright for my liking. But this can be fixed pretty easily. I've just loaded up some Naggaroth Night from Games Workshop and proceed to spray it into the sections that I want to be in shadows. Usually this is underarms and anything that you would think would be dark. By choosing a color like purple instead of something like black, it does actually contrast the armor a lot nicer and gives you an overall better look as it has a lot more tonal depth compared to that of the red. So the way I paint is usually pretty chaotic, so I'm choosing to block in the silver details next. Even though I tend to jump around my models, I usually follow a simple process of painting large areas first, and then other colors that will be shaded with the same wash. I've recently discovered that Tamiya metallics are a thing, and I've actually really enjoyed working with them. The only downside they have is that it usually takes a couple of coats to get full opacity, but they are such vibrant metallics. So I'm just going to start by blocking in the metallics using this titanium silver. At this point, I tend to go for really bright metallic colors, as it allows me to do more weathering and effects later down the track, without losing too much of its vibrancy. The next step was pretty straightforward. I just used some Games Workshop Rhinox hide to fill in all the brown details. And just for the last of the base coats, I used some Scale 75 Decay Black and went over his armor webbing, sword, gun, and some smaller details that needed to be blacked in. Finally, I just used some Liquitex Neutral Grey 5 and slapped it all over the base as a foundation for our basing. So I plan to use an oil wash to shade the entirety of this model. For this mix, I made it at roughly 3 parts mineral turpentine to 1 part oil paint. I do make all my black washes from the same Payne's Grey that I found at a cheap store. It cost me about $2 and has lasted me for months at this point. Usually when working with oil washes, you don't need to varnish your model beforehand. If you're using something like an Artist Spirit, you won't need to seal your model since the concentration is a lot less than that of mineral terps. The combination of thin airbrush layers and concentrated spirits tends to pull some of the previous coats off. So if you're going to use something like mineral terps that's a really harsh chemical, I would highly recommend varnishing your model with something like a gloss varnish, which will just help it flow over everything quite nicely. So for this, I'm just going to use the airbrush to apply a couple thin coats of Lamy and medium, This seals everything in nicely and mattes down the entire model. Usually you want to avoid matte varnish on metallics as it dulls them, but I couldn't really tell the difference. And the reason I chose a metallic varnish for this is because I wanted to tone down everything quite a lot instead of just having them super bright after this process. After letting that dry, I applied the oil wash all over the model. As you can see, this kind of leaves it looking like a complete mess, but if you bear with me, it will look a lot better. I grabbed some disposable eyeshadow removers and some clean terps. Since the wash was still quite wet, I could use the eyeshadow remover to just dab up any excess pools of wash. And once that's all done, add a little bit of terps to the sponge and dab off the areas that I feel need to be much brighter. This step is pretty quick and effective and allows you to have a lot more control over the shadow placement and fix any mistakes that you made. Think of it as like the Photoshop of washes. Now that we have some definition on the model, there's a few other areas that are lacking in depth. For the brown leather materials, I wanted to add a small highlight of Mornfang brown to liven them up. Instead of using edge highlighting, I instead chose to stipple down along the edges and create slight blemishes by drawing thin lines across the surface. This just allows it to break up the big flat areas. To really make this model pop, I'm going to fill in all the gold details now. It's a pretty easy process of just using Retributor armor to fill in all the trims and gold decals. And just like that, we're almost done with this guy. To help finish this one off, I'm just going to add some Agrex Earthquake to quickly shade all these details and just give it a little bit more depth. We can move on to the base's final touches. Over the years of hobbying, I've amassed a small army of various tufts. For my Khorne army, I've used a combination of army, painter flock, and some gamer's grass dead tufts. I can't really remember the names of all of them as I threw the packaging out quite a few years ago. To attach the tufts, I used a generous helping of PVA glue and stuck them on. They do come with an adhesive already on them, but I've tended to find that this doesn't actually hold them onto the base too well. And then I quickly coloured the rim in with Steel Legion Drab to suit the rest of my army. Now, just when I thought I had finished, I realised I wasn't quite happy with how the red turned out. Although there was some contrast between the dark and the lighter parts of the armour, I wanted to push this further. If you're just going for a nice speed paint, you can just leave your model here, or you can take the extra step by using some Mephiston red to go around the model and pick out any areas that you think might need to be brighter. I did this on this guy, and as you can see, it really livens the whole model up. Now, with that being the actual final step, this model is 100% complete. I have to say I'm really happy with how quickly this model came together. The purple shadows and the bright red highlights emphasize the right areas and draw your eye in quite nicely. The fact that our Zenithal highlight gives us a huge head start also cuts down on the amount of time we're going to need to paint an entire squad, or even an entire army of these guys. If you guys have any questions about my painting process, make sure to leave them in the comments down below. If you do want to support the channel, make sure to leave a like so that I know you're enjoying the videos, and don't forget to subscribe to keep updated with everything I do. Until next time everyone, happy wargaming.